I really like Jonathan's poking of the balloon and trying to work out what happens around here. One of my concerns is as we start to look at the kind of the indirect effects and say we need to protect the concerns of individuals who may at second, third, fourth hand be influenced by something that happened a long way away from them. As a trialist, you start to make it infeasible for me to do the trial. And I think we need to find the right balance, because these trials, when they're well done, can generate important information that will benefit many people. But by putting forward the kind of protection of any possible person that may be impacted by the trial as being the thing that we have to protect against, we really likely, or I think there's a real danger that we actually sort of then make these trials completely infeasible. So I'm not sure what the right balance is, but I think one of the things we're trying to do is find a way in which we can have that discourse, because at the moment it becomes very easy to think, well, my third cousin twice removed might actually have a lousy phone call from me because I've had bad big toe surgery, and therefore maybe we need to protect that individual, and therefore we can't do the actual research. And I think that's fundamentally one of the challenges that the trialists often feel, that ethics REP processes can be over-restrictive, and you have to think of 27 different harms that might happen to people, whereas I think the counters, REBs clearly have legitimate concerns. And so that's where I think a lot of what we're talking about is trying to find a practical way forward, so both, wherever possible, the right sort of path can be done.
So yeah, thank you. So I guess then I agree. I guess I have two responses. The first response is I think that we err when we assume that the burdens of protecting the various actors within a system fall entirely on the shoulders of a single node in that system. And I think part of what's very compelling about the framework that you have addressed is that you have found a way to develop a division of labor within this system of protection. That makes, to me, a lot of sense. I think there probably is a richer division of labor to be developed. So I guess I would want to think about the different actors and the different responsibilities and the various sort of lines that go between the various actors. And that is, again, worth many more years of work. That's a complicated issue. The other issue I think I want to address really quickly is, what are the criteria? So clearly, you poke a system, you get these ripple effects, and the moral, gravity of the impact of those ripples attenuates perhaps with the distance. Now, with that metaphor, what do we mean by distance, morally speaking? We surely can't mean spatial distance. And I also think we probably don't mean by that the proximity of the intervention. If I get you to give a poison to someone else, the fact there's an intermediary does not necessarily launder me from the moral harm of encouraging the delivery of a poison to a person. So I think one has to sort of think about what are the various moral criteria that we use to ascribe some kind of attenuation of moral responsibility in that system.
Thanks. It's Sarah Viebeck from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Institute of Population and Public Health, and thanks very much for these presentations. Just a couple of questions around gatekeepers. And I think you alluded to this in your presentation, Angela, but the process by which gatekeepers are actually selected, and I'm just wondering about how we know when we have the right gatekeeper for access to a particular cluster. And you did give a nod to gatekeepers as having a potential role to assist with the dissemination of research results. But one thing we haven't heard a lot about today, and perhaps you'll handle this in your deliberations over the next few days, is the feedback process of research results and to whom these results should be fed back to in terms of either the gatekeepers or perhaps the participants in the study themselves. Similarly, when you speak about vulnerable populations and these may or may not apply, depending, I guess, on the nature of the study, but the interface between the guidelines that you're developing for cluster randomized trials and other guidelines that exist. For example, the existing guidelines for research with Aboriginal people and the nature of community engagement that may be required there, and similarly the forthcoming guidelines for research conducted with children and youth, and so how your guidelines for cluster randomized control trials may interface with these other guidelines that exist and may be a particular concern for your area. And then finally, and I'm wondering if you might be able to comment on this, but we've talked a bit today about the notion of research subjects and the notion of identifiable data and privacy. And I'm wondering about how this applies at the cluster level in terms of anonymity at the cluster level, and whether gatekeepers actually may have a role to play in agreeing for the cluster itself to be identified or not.
For the question of identifying gatekeepers, I think that's a really good question, and it's I think to a large extent it's going to be somewhat context dependent to figure out whether a gatekeeper actually has the authority or not. But one of the things that we wanted to emphasize in the paper, I think, is that, so first of all, rarely, if ever, will a gatekeeper have the authority, legitimate authority, to consent on behalf of individuals in cluster trials that are administering the intervention at the individual level. And with respect to the cluster trials, so when I laid out those four points, the third and fourth points were meant in a sense to be conditions that, so to the extent that it's unclear whether this falls within the purview of the individual's role, and to the extent that it's uncertain whether the constituents within the cluster or the constituency actually do accept this as a role on the part of the person we're considering as gatekeeper, that has the potential to diminish the authority, the legitimate authority of this person to act as a gatekeeper. So part of the hope is that those things can help to address the question of whether an individual that you're considering using as a gatekeeper actually has legitimate authority to serve this role.
Those are very, very helpful questions. Thank you. I guess I just wanted to make it sort of a bigger picture comment, just as someone who's done research ethics for a long time. Until this project, I'd actually never encountered the concept of gatekeepers. And so I just wanted to identify the uniqueness of gatekeepers in the cluster randomized trial context. And it's a very interesting function. I liked very much Jonathan's description of the virtues of a gatekeeper, in part being part of a distribution of labor in terms of protecting the various interests at stake. That's a very nice way of putting it. As I read the cluster randomized trials ethics literature, I get the sense that a lot of the impetus for gatekeepers arose out of concerns for the protection of individual interests in cluster randomized trials because of various difficulties in obtaining informed consent, either for randomization or for cluster level interventions. I think the effect of our work has been to diminish the need for gatekeepers to protect individual interests. But I think importantly, there are roles for gatekeepers to play to protect cluster level interests, community interests, and also, interestingly, organizational interests. So when cluster trials take place in hospitals or nursing homes or schools, that there are important organizational interests in terms of staff time, resources, impact on other programs. And I think that role has not received enough emphasis within the literature. So there's a lot to say, but I just wanted to make that sort of big picture comment.
It's Kathy Lohr from RTI. I thought those two sets of comments are ones I'm hoping somebody got down because they were very useful. We've heard several comments throughout the day about some of the language for the project as a whole, and I know I kind of perked up at gatekeeper because in certain circumstances, and they're more historical than not probably in the US anyway, gatekeeper is a very negative notion. And it generally has the connotation of people who say no. So I would just encourage you to think that if you're going to define or use the term, and you may well want to stick with it, that you've defined it pretty carefully. One of the issues that I didn't understand is why the person had to have legitimate democratic authority. I would have thought, I don't know what democratic is being contrasted with, small case d, and I think I would suggest you may want to lose that term. I think, let me stick with that, and if I have some other thoughts I did about language, I may just send it on to Jeremy or everybody, to Mark. Okay. Thanks.
That's a really interesting point. So I had, somebody else had raised the question of where the language of gatekeeper came from. And I'm not sure if this holds true for others, but for me, gatekeepers, I had just automatically associated it with, in Canada, we have the role of gatekeepers in sort of general medicine and that, right, where general practitioners serve the role of gatekeepers, or they're thought to serve the role of gatekeepers. In sort of, you have to see the general practitioner in order to get anywhere with specialists and move on through the system. And so I'm not sure that it has that kind of connotation of being necessarily sort of or automatically associated with no. So that's a really interesting point to bring up. Yeah.
I think you're probably safe with trying to keep the language, but just remember that for some people, gatekeepers are going to say no. Yeah. Their whole predilection is to say no on behalf of insurers or facilities or whatever.
No, that's
so you'll have to kind of work around that. Yeah. Whether or not you have some other language you want to try to use, not necessarily for this concept, of proxy or surrogate decision makers, that kind of thing, because I think particularly for children and perhaps incapacitated people and so forth, there's the gatekeeper for the cluster, and then there's a set of people who may have to say yay or nay, and they're operating in a somewhat different kind of context, and on behalf of different entities than the facility or the setting or the ward or whatever.
Thanks. And so with your, thanks very much for that. And with your second question, I mean, so the reason for inserting the democratic bit into the democratic legitimacy was a function, I think, of, so my background is in part in legal philosophy, where legitimacy can just refer to the obligatory force of the law or regulations or whatnot. And that may have nothing to do with the justness of the law in democratic terms. And so it was kind of to highlight that we're not just talking about, cases where it is written that a person has the authority to make these sorts of decisions, and the people are, they're obliged by it, they're following along with that, but it's that there's actually something about this institution that resonates with them enough that they are going along of their own accord with the gatekeeper's decisions and that sort of thing. So that's why having the democratic in there. I don't know whether we want to keep that contentious language or not, but we'll think about it. Thank you.
Democratic is good. I just want to expand on that a little bit. I mean, I think for me, one of the so there are a number of really difficult challenges about cluster randomized trials. The interventions at the cluster level pose all kinds of really difficult problems. The way that the unit of randomization, unit of experimentation, and unit of observation can pull apart causes really difficult problems. But one of the other things that raises is a core source of challenges is the fact that cluster trials involve a really heterogeneous set of social groups. And the moral status of those groups is kind of not so worked out, right? There's a literature thinking about communities and the involvement of communities with organized political structures and elected leaders and that sort of thing in research. But cluster randomized trials, yes, they involve communities sometimes, but they also involve, sports teams and hospital wards and schools and geographical areas and neighborhoods, and trying to think through how to account for group level interests and people who might speak on behalf of those groups in various ways, I think is one of the central challenges of this project. One of the ways in which people may speak on behalf of a group is in some sort of authoritative sense of giving permission for that group to participate in the study, and in effect giving consent. We think that's only really legitimately applies in a narrow set of cases where that individual has legitimate democratic authority to provide consent on behalf of the group. But there are other roles for gatekeepers, and really important roles, I think, in terms of consultation. And involvement in consultative processes, it seems to me, can play a very important role in protecting cluster-level interests, but don't require the gatekeeper to have anything like sort of legitimate political authority. That requirement only attaches to basically the function of being able to legitimately give consent on behalf of the cluster or not.
Comments from the webcast are quite brief and probably don't require any kind of reply from the panel members. The first comes from Laura Lee Bockwell from the Secretariat for Research Ethics here in Ottawa, just reminding us that Chapter 9 of the new Tri-Council policy has a lot to say about looking at sort of the role for community decision makers and the relationship between community decision makers and the needs of the members of those communities. And the second is from Matthew Feldman in the United States, who does, I gather, cluster trials in the VA system in the area of mental health, and just asking whether we would consider listing or thinking of acute mental illness as a separate cause for vulnerability, separate from being an incapable adult, because quite often people who are mentally ill may have the capacity to make decisions, but may at the same time be vulnerable for other reasons. So we may want to consider adding that to our list of reasons for being vulnerable.
Okay, for the webcast there was nodding, which isn't an exceptionally useful communication technique over a webcast. Thank you very much for both of those.
Annette Brown from 3IE. So I'm going to bring up some of the development issues again, because when I hear gatekeeper and I think about the development context, I sort of cringe. So first of all, thinking about legitimate democratic authority, whether or not you include the word democratic, even trying to define legitimate authority in the development context, obviously, is very tricky. You could spend as much of your paper trying to defend your choice of this gatekeeper as meeting that definition as you could spend doing anything else. I also think that approaching them for any kind of consent, as you suggested, could raise other ethical issues because, for example, most village leaders in a lot of low and middle income countries, consent is going to be granted based on whether you pay the appropriate research registration fee directly to that person. And so you have issues around what are we willing to do in order to get consent from this gatekeeper. My even greater concern, though, is this crossover between these kinds of authorities and your vulnerable populations. A lot of times these populations are vulnerable exactly because of these authorities. And so by involving them, whether through consent or not, you're giving them information that could jeopardize the interest of the people who are supposed to be benefited by the research. So if I think about, for example, female family planning interventions, the authority, the village elder or the mayor may say, oh, of course, but now that person knows this is going on. I need to tell other people, the men in my community, to make sure that they're not partaking of these services. Or female genital mutilation would be another one whereby involving these people, you could actually be hurting the interests of your vulnerable population that you're trying to benefit. So I don't have any answers, but just that the whole concept of introducing this gatekeeper raises a lot of concerns, I think, in the development context.
So this was actually another issue that I had that I wanted to raise that I omitted, but the question of involvement of gatekeepers who don't have the moral standing to stand in as gatekeepers. And I think that initially our impulse would be to say, well, they have no bearing, they have no role whatsoever in initiation or conduct of cluster studies. But it strikes me that part of the concern in some of the settings where these studies are undertaken, especially in conditions where you have extremes of inequality between the recipients of the intervention, say, and the researchers, is that one needs to establish buy-in from the community. And I think that the paper has discussed the role of gatekeepers in terms of establishing that buy-in. But that may mean that one may be involving gatekeepers who don't have any moral standing. There may be, in fact, a moral obligation in some ways to be engaging gatekeepers who don't have any moral standing, in the sense that, number one, that the entire research project may not be, launchable unless they're involved. But secondarily, that if you screw up in that setting, you potentially make it harder for the next researcher who comes along to do that investigation. And that seems to me that one wants to be very careful about what kind of dynamic one establishes in that setting. And that may mean sometimes engaging actors who, in a way, are sort of morally sort of quite not necessarily clearly linked to the actors. I don't know, to me, it seems like an interesting question to be thinking about here.
I think that's really helpful, and that is part of what I was thinking about with the third case study that I introduced. And so the idea there was in part that, people may have legitimate concerns about involving these community leaders as gatekeepers who have the ability to give access to this population, and I think that's entirely reasonable. But it may also serve, part of what I was trying to make, one of the points I was trying to make was that it could also serve a really helpful role in terms of kind of promoting the kind of the values that are underlying this research and the sort of and some attitudes that seem to be kind of coming in with the research that that could be beneficial to the research subject participants. The other thing that I wanted to say in response to your comment that was really helpful to kind of bring attention to the challenge of even talking about democratic legitimacy in some of these settings is that I think that's certainly a good point to keep in mind. But our strategy hasn't been to kind of introduce these roles and endorse them for gatekeepers, but rather to look at the roles that researchers are giving to gatekeepers and try and say something about when it's legitimate to do that and when it's not. And so hopefully say something about, look, yeah, if you haven't met these sort of conditions that as I've called them, these sort of success conditions for democratic legitimacy in these settings, then you may well be really wary of giving these people the authority to give permission to conduct these trials in these situations.
So, Abba Saxena from WHO again. My question is, in fact, my comments are related to the role that you're ascribing to gatekeepers beyond the permission to conduct the research. And something you said, that gatekeepers may identify individuals who meet eligibility criteria. And that actually goes a little bit against the fiduciary relationship that, say, the physician gatekeepers have with patients in terms of privacy and confidentiality. So their fiduciary relationship, it makes it important for them to maintain the confidentiality of the information they have, and they cannot or should not be giving that information to researchers to help them identify. So I think you'll need to perhaps rethink that again and make sure that this is sort of balanced. In the same way, when we talk about hospital administrators being gatekeepers, as you mentioned, and to be, the thing is that these people perhaps also have a conflict of interest, and that needs to be kept in mind. For example, if you're doing a patient safety research study and the hospital administrator has an interest in knowing who is the person who is making, has a high patient safety research adverse event rate. And that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to identify the systems level. So they have a conflict of interest, and that needs to be kept in mind. And I think your whole analysis needs a little bit of a tweaking here and there to make sure that the ethical principles enshrined in other things are not conflicting with the gatekeeper roles that you're trying to provide to them. And finally, you talked about vulnerability and other issues, which I think when you write them down or when you sort of put them as guidelines, there are existing guidelines which already talk of these issues. So just to make sure that there is consistency between existing guidelines and these guidelines.
When Monica was talking very early on about doing interviews with trialists who'd done trials and ethics committee chairs and things, I may have missed you saying, did you do any interviews with people who had taken part in trials as participants, as research participants? Because one of the issues that we always find in trials that we do is that it's quite important to do a sort of, like almost an audit of people who are taking part in trials to find out how it was for them. And that is a way of trying to find out whether the process of approaching them and the gatekeeper role, if there has been one, has felt okay for them, both in terms of that trial and in trying to learn from that trial for future trials. Now, you may have discussed this already, and if you have, I apologise.
I think the short answer is just stand by, because that is actually planned, but we haven't yet started the process. We were planning to do focus groups with trial participants at both the cluster level, the individual level, and also with gatekeepers.
I've got a couple of comments, really. The first is a purely terminological one. You might find that the term guardian better fits your purposes, and indeed it's the term that we used 12 years ago in the paper we published in the British Medical Journal. So that might better suit your purposes. I don't think, on reflection, it suited our purposes as we had then. I think the term gatekeeper was more what we had in mind. Following on from that, the more substantive point is about the role that the individual has in order that they're in a position to give consent to trial enrolment. And I'm wondering how that squares with what Andrew was talking about earlier when he was saying that it wasn't necessary to reveal all the detail about all the various trial arms to the individuals. So on what basis can they give consent to randomisation if they're not told that there's a possible control? Sorry, I just saw a sharp intake of breath over there, and I was expecting a big reaction, but we'll probably wait for that. And the final quick comment is to say that I'm very thrilled by the idea that you'll be interviewing members of the clusters. And indeed, that's something that one of my PhD students, Satvo Lignu, is doing out in Mumbai with David Osrin. So, yes, we'll maybe have to collaborate more on that.
Oh.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. I would like to talk to you more about that. Is just to clarify what we were saying with regard to sort of the tailoring of the consent process in certain cases. We were only there referring to instances of informed consent that was occurring after the randomization of clusters. So of course, if individuals are being approached for informed consent prior to randomization of the clusters, then there would naturally need to be a full disclosure of what's going on in all of the arms that they might end up allocated to. The only issue sort of after individuals had been randomized that really the choice that was before them was determined, right? Yeah. That either the decision is to carry on with the treatment to which, the intervention, sorry, to which their cluster has been allocated, or not participate in the study, and thus we thought that consent might reasonably be relatively focused on the choice in fact before the individual.
So they're giving consent to the intervention rather than to trial enrolment and to having been randomized?
So they're giving consent to trial enrollment and to the intervention.
But I thought that had been determined.
Yep, sure, go.
So what we're talking about now, I think, is the gatekeepers, and
No. In an individual cluster trial, where I take it you're trying to downplay the authority of the gatekeeper, and saying that it's the individual who's going to be receiving the intervention should be in a position to consent or refuse. Now, it's exactly to what they're consenting or refusing that I'm interested in. Is it just the intervention, or is it something more, which is what I took from your presentation? You know, why inform them about randomisation and trial enrolment otherwise?
well, it's likely the intervention and any data collection around that. So if you like, they've been allocated already to a cluster, so their intervention choice is fixed. And what they're now trying to do, but what they can do is say, yeah, I can refuse that intervention. I can also refuse the data collection aspects of the intervention of the trial.
So why tell them that they've been randomised? Why tell them that they've been randomised?
Well, just general. I mean, general requirements to be honest about how it is that we've come to approach someone. That it's happening at a certain point further down the road in the process than in standard randomized controlled trials. Look, I mean, I think in the literature there's been this assumption that randomization, because people generally provide consent prior to randomization in standard patient randomized controlled trials, there's this assumption that one of the things that people need to consent for is the randomization. I think we're actually challenging that, and we're saying that, in our paper at least, we're suggesting that so long as individuals, if it's impossible to approach individuals prior to randomization, and they're approached as soon as possible and prior to any study interventions for consent, that the moral requirements of informed consent can be fully fulfilled. There's no need to appeal to a gatekeeper to give permission for randomization. That's the point that we're making. It might be one that people would disagree with, but
so one way that you might understand it, if I understand it right, is that the sense in which they consent to randomization is by continuing to participate, is by agreeing to participate in the trial after they've been informed that they've been randomized to a particular arm.
Okay, so why stop there
so they can't,
and then not tell them what the other arms are? I mean, randomization implies that it's something or something else,
right?
And you're not telling them what the something else is.
Yeah, no. So I think, I mean, so Andrew and I have had discussions about this, and we've disagreed about how much information there's an obligation to tell research subject participants about with respect to what's going on in the other arms. I tend to be more sort of that there should be more disclosure and that sort of thing. But I think it's something that, so one way that you might address it is that there's not a need to tell them at that point about what's going on, detailed information about what's going on in the other arms, because, as they've said, it's already been decided. So in a way, this is your choice. You either participate in this intervention arm or you don't participate in the trial. I think personally that at some point along the way, for the sake of the legitimacy of institutions, there should be a mechanism in place to let subjects know that this choice has been made and that what's gone on.
I just wondered if it'd be useful to draw on the sort of discussion and literature around responsibilities to sort of pick up on some of the points that are coming up. So particularly, we might draw responsibilities based on role, and that might be this issue of gatekeepers and sort of build on that. But also some of the points that Jonathan made. So we're talking about sort of poking and sort of downstream effects. We could talk about sort of causal responsibilities, but also distinguish that, through the lens of sort of foreseeability and things like that, from sort of moral responsibility of downstream effects. And we also have the social science around sort of how you sort of link those outcomes to the intervention. But I think we also have the opportunity to sort of split retrospective and prospective responsibilities in terms of sort of assigning praise or blame, but also prospectively and sort of maybe looking at the work of Colin MacLeod about strategic allocation, but also principled allocations as well, and sort of maybe engaging those who don't have the moral authority but have a strategic role. And maybe that language might be useful here.
I see lots of notes being taken, so thank you very much for that comment and nodding. Nobody's responding. No, it doesn't need a response. No. Okay, that was great. Thank you very much indeed for that.